welcome everyone to our panel where we talk about listening and learning from majority world, Indigenous and diaspora voices, and also look at the launch of Salt, Light and City Volume 2. It's wonderful to have you with us as we have this discussion. We've got some wonderful panelists with us today, and I thought that I might just take a few moments to introduce each of them. Lisa Rodriguez Watson, for over a decade, has served as an urban church planter, collegiate minister, and international missionary. Her heart is to see people reconciled to God and to one another. And this has led her to invest her life, family, and ministry in places and people that have often been overlooked by the world. Lisa has been involved in planting a grassroots organisation in Memphis, committed to mobilising Christians to love their undocumented neighbours and consider an appropriate Christian response to our world's immigration crisis. She's worked as leadership development and training director at Christian Community Development Association and is now the national director of Missional Alliance. So welcome, Lisa. We've also have with us Grace Gison Kim, who's a Korean American theologian and professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion in Indiana. She's written numerous books, one book recently with me, which I was very excited about. And she writes in a whole range of topics, including the experience of Korean women immigrants to North America, constructive theology, feminist theology, post-colonial theology, and a wide range of other topics. Rarely a year goes by when there aren't a number of books coming out from Grace, and they're always really exciting and stimulating. Brooke Prentice is an Aboriginal Christian leader and descendant of the Waka Waka people. Brooke is the CEO of Common Grace, a community of 50,000 Australians working for justice and coordinator of the Grass Tree Gathering. And Sarah Bacala specialises in Christian thought and history with a particular interest in the philosophy of Christian thought. She serves in the online department of Stirling College, tutors in theology, and is doing a PhD at Western Sydney University. So thanks everyone for joining us. We're really looking forward to being with you today, exploring this topic together about what does it mean to listen to what God is saying and doing in the world today, particularly amongst voices that we don't often listen to. How do the voices of the global south or the majority world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Indigenous and Native peoples, immigrant and diaspora peoples, how do they awaken us to what God is doing in the world today? How do they enliven our faith? How do they show us what it means to truly be God's people in discipleship, mission, faith, and a commitment to following Jesus Christ wherever he may lead? I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Graham. Well, it's exciting to be here with all of you and exciting to be celebrating the release of this second volume in Graham's Salt, Light and the City book series. I don't know if there are any more volumes planned, Graham. But we're going to start off with a question for the panelists that asks you, why is listening to Indigenous, diaspora and majority world voices important for the future of the church and mission? And whoever wants to kick off first can jump in. Otherwise, I'll choose one of you. So go for it.
Well, my microphone is not silent or mute, so I'll just jump in. Graham, once again, congratulations. I think this is your second book this year, but you just have another third book. We can't keep up with your publications this year, so it's been a great publishing year for you. So congratulations, and I was honored when you asked me to write the foreword, so thank you for allowing me to write the foreword to the book. And I read it over again today, and I thought, okay, that's just a little bit of me for your big project. So, you know, the first question that you asked, Sarah, I think it's so important that we hear different voices. Firstly, because for the last 2,000 years of Christianity, we've just been hearing only white European male voices. And they did all the doctrines, all the theology, the philosophy, how we worship, and, you know, the language that we use. So that was the only language that we had. And as missionaries, Graham's book talks about missionaries and the word being shared. When we think about how missionaries went around the world. So, I was born in Korea. So white missionaries came to Korea and they shared the white Jesus and white God. And even, 100 years later, 50 years later, depends when you're going to look at the history of Christianity in Korea, we still have a very white Jesus and a white God. And so, people like me and silence voices, and I'm so glad, Graham, you have all these women on your panel today. Women have been silenced for so long, but I think, it's so important that we hear these voices when we're talking about God, when we're talking about the church, when we're talking about missions around the world, because when we understand God, God is always on the side of the oppressed. God is with the oppressed. And so if God is on the side of the oppressed, we can't keep hearing the superior voices or the voices that have been the elite white male voices. So I think it's long overdue. And so I'm so glad that in Graham's book, he was able to lift these voices up. That's rarely done. And so that's why I get so excited when Graham has another book, because he's always lifting up voices. All the Global Church Project, the videos that he does, so many are just from voices around the globe, the less heard voices that are so important to hear. So, and I can go on and on and on, but I feel like I should just be quiet now. I'll come back to it later. But that's why it's important, because it's always been the white male voices and long overdue. So Graham, thanks for lifting our voices, and even today's platform for giving voices to us. So thank you, Graham.
Thank you, Grace. Lisa or Brooke or Graham, why is listening to these voices important?
I think Grace gave such a wonderful answer. And by the way, let me also share my congratulations to you, Graham, for the launch of this second book. I'm excited for it to be out into the world and for folks to get to engage with it and engage with the authors that you've highlighted in the book. It's phenomenal. And to add to what Grace has already said, I think, because we have a fundamental belief that God is active in all the cultures across the whole world, why would we not listen to voices from these places where we commonly actually can't hear people from? In fact, the truth is exactly what Grace was saying is we've heard for hundreds of years the white European male perspective of Christian faith and expression and theology. And it's long past time for us to hear from the rest of the world, as God has been working in their cultures and through their language and in creation to reveal himself to those people. And with the world globalizing as it is, the future of the church really does depend on our ability to listen to one another and learn from one another. So I guess I think that's probably the only small piece that I would add to what Grace has already said.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, definitely a valuable piece to add. Brooke, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I also just want to add my congratulations to you, Graham, for Salt, Light and a City Volume 2. And I'm still incredibly humbled to be included in the book, and especially for my name, Brooke Prentice, to sit beside the likes of Richard Twiss, Randy Woodley and Hochebed as well. So thank you, and thank you for having me as part of this panel today. I guess as an Indigenous theologian in particular, part of our culture is about listening, and we particularly talk about deep listening. And so that's been part of our cultures for thousands of years. And when we look at these lands now called Australia, and the last 250 years of colonization, and I also always say that post-colonial is only an academic aspiration, not a lived reality. When you look at the lives of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia today, and including the lives of us as Aboriginal Christian leaders, and how we're excluded from the church in Australia. There is not full inclusion nor full equality, so we still have a long way to go. And so that's part of the beauty of today, that Graham, as a white male theologian in Australia, with me as an Indigenous theologian in these lands now called Australia, can come together with voices from around the world. And I'm reminded of Terry LeBlanc's words, where he said, when you look into the voices of Indigenous theologians, you can hear the voice of God anew. And this is important for the future of the church. I was talking just this week to a podcast about church planters and the future of the church. And I said, if you go to plant a church in these lands now called Australia, and you start out with no relationship with Aboriginal peoples, you haven't listened deeply enough. And so we still have to listen deeply. And why we have to listen deeply is because as Aboriginal peoples placed here in these lands thousands of years ago, we are part of God's story. We always have been. The boundaries of our over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia, we didn't determine those boundaries. Creator God determined those boundaries. And that's a story we continue to today. And so the future of the church, the current church, every church building sits upon Indigenous land. And Creator God placed us here as custodians, stewards, caretakers. And still after 250 years of dispossession, destruction, death, we're still inviting non-Indigenous peoples into relationship with us. And particularly us as Aboriginal Christian leaders, with the power and story of Jesus, that is who we cling so tightly to. And after all that, we still invite that relationship, because we know that that relationship, community, brings the healing, the hope, and that fullness of life that we receive fully in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Thanks
And
so
can I
much,
just
Brooke.
add?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, here in North America, we don't listen to the Indigenous voices, the Native American, the Aboriginals in Canada, and it's long overdue. What we do is we just take away the land, and we just talk about conquer and conquest and colonialism. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's so important that around the world that we listen to Indigenous voices, because I think the Indigenous voices have a deeper spirituality, which is lost in the Western mind and Western thought. So I'm always thankful for Indigenous voices for shedding light in our spirituality and our understanding of God as spirit, because that's kind of my passion for looking at who God is and the spirit of God. So thank you to both Lisa and Brooke. That was wonderful.
Great. Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Brooke. Now, Graham, we could just tell people to go and read your book, but would you like to weigh in on that question as well?
I would just say that right at the heart of all ministry, mission, and theology is humility, service, and listening. And if we are truly disciples of Jesus Christ, then that humility and service, openness to others, and desire to listen deeply must be at the heart of all we do, and certainly at the heart of any theologizing and ministry that we do.
Thanks, Graham. And I guess, as even just thinking at an individual level, we actually don't know who we are until we're in contrast to someone who's not us, do we? So there's a lot to be said about learning through others. My second question for all of you, and perhaps we might get into some contextual specifics here too, what are Indigenous diaspora and majority world voices teaching us about Christian mission in particular? I should have rolled my dice, shouldn't I? Sorry, Graham.
Well, there's so many things.
I was going to go too, but Graham, you go ahead.
Oh, well, sorry, Graham. It's really hard to know where to start. I mean, as I travelled around the globe interviewing Christian leaders, asking them what is God doing in your context, and tell us your stories, your experiences, how God is revealing God self to us in the world. There's so many things I learned, and I'll just give you one example, and that is that often in the West we artificially separate things. So mind and body, spirit and word, proclamation and justice or social care. And these distinctions are so artificial. They don't reflect anything, I think, of the heart of God or the way in which Jesus Christ revealed himself in the Gospels, and why we cling to them in such a artificial, destructive way is beyond me. One of the things that has really struck me, for instance, is the way in which it's impossible to really be a people who value the scriptures and who are committed to justice unless we are also walking in the power and presence and love and grace of the Spirit of God. Often we separate word and justice and spirit, and these things get emphasized in different traditions, but why we would ever want to separate them, I have no idea. And as I listen to my brothers and sisters right across the world, I hear that same refrain. So, for instance, I was talking to Julie and Wansuk Ma, who look at grassroots Christian movements in Asia, and they said to me, what the West calls Pentecostalism, Asia calls Christianity. And you know, I just think if we can get back to a much more holistic, integrated view of faith and mission, it will make a huge difference to us.
Yeah, so Graham, just to tag on what you just said, I think, you know, these days I'm thinking I need to write a book on the whole devastating problem of dualism, because I think that's what you were touching on. I think the Western Christianity, Western European Christianity, based on Greco-Roman philosophy, broke everything down in dualism. So as you mentioned, you know, heaven and earth, body and spirit, they were all separated. And I think the indigenous voices and the majority world voices, you know, and you know, I'm an Asian, so I know in Asia, we don't want to separate them like that in the two dualism. I think it's very destructive. I know other theologians have pointed that out. And, you know, I think maybe that might be the biggest problem today too, as we talk about things in these dualistic terms rather than the holistic terms. So I think that's why it's so important that we hear these voices that have been silenced for so long. And so when missionaries go and when we are engaged in mission work, I think, and I know Christians around the world hate the word syncretism or how we talk about the mixing of ideas, but it has always been part of Christianity. It's been part of Judaism. When we look at the Old Testament passages, syncretism has always been present. So I think we learn from the voices that have been silenced, from indigenous voices and the voices around the world that have been silenced, and we come up with newer ways of talking about who God is. Because the presence of God in the world is only captured by our own language, our own experiences. So if we're just going to look at the white male experiences, that's so limiting. You know, there's such a small percentage of the world. Half the world are Asians. So, you know, we have a ton of experiences that are different. So if we want a more deeper and a more holistic understanding of who God is and God's presence in the world and how God is working in the world, then yeah, you got to listen to Asian voices, Native American voices, indigenous voices, and the majority voices around the world. So I think that's why in Graham's book, I see he's emphasizing this and lifting and bringing these voices to the forefront. It's so important for us to hear, because he's a white male doing this. And, you know, a lot of people will listen to white male. So if he's doing this, then he's giving this push to say, let's listen to the other voices that have been silenced for so long. So I'm grateful for, you know, all the work that Graham does. And, you know, he talks about listening, and he's such a good listener. Sometimes I'm not a good listener, so I learn from Graham how to listen better. So thank you, Graham, for the book and for all the stuff that you do.
Actually, I think you're a wonderful listener, Grace, but
I think you're a much better listener, though, because you listen intently. I'm just sitting there listening, but you're very intently listening. So I think I learned a lot from you. So thank you, Graham.
Well, we can do a poll in a little while and people can observe and decide who looks like the better listener out of the two of you. But in the meantime, Lisa or Brooke, would either of you like to weigh in on that one? Not on the who's a better listener, of course, but on Majority World Voices and Mission.
I'm waiting for you, Brooke.
Oh, sorry, I just had trouble unmuting. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Grace and Graham and Sarah. I think I'm still stuck on the listening competition and would love you all to come and sit on country and have Aboriginal elders teach you about listening. That would be really beautiful. Maybe sometime we can do that in the future.
I need to do that soon. Yeah, next time I come to Australia, you must take me there so that I can learn. Yeah, please take me.
Yep, and there's places you can learn where you live too with the Indigenous people of those areas too, so we can look into that as well. I think as we talked about dualism, I think for me as well, where we need to learn, and I'll particularly talk about Indigenous voices and what Indigenous voices can teach about Christian mission. There's dualism, but there's also the individualism. And so I often call that, the individualism that we're still seeing in the Australian church, because that's my context, is preventing this deeper sense of who God is. It's a call to be in community. And as Aboriginal peoples, our culture is centered around community. And when one person is missing or sick or injured, we know community is not whole. And so we structure our lives around making sure community is whole and healthy. And I think that's where Indigenous peoples have so much to teach non-Indigenous Christians about what that actually means, and that individualism to me often sounds like colonization. And I think the church has often turned the Great Commission into this very colonial kind of activity, and there's many different adjectives to describe colonization. So I guess one of the things I've said is about reclaiming community. That's not Indigenous people reclaiming community, it's us teaching non-Indigenous people about what community actually is and teaching the church. And I think, even the concept of mission here in Australia, when Aboriginal people were removed from our lands, forced into slavery, 10-year-olds sent out, never paid a single wage, that's what we call the stolen wages, worked their whole lives. Our elders are still fighting for that money today. That the Aboriginal people were placed on mission and on missions. And so often this word mission, obviously in a Christian context, and some of these were Christian missions, but it can send a shiver up my spine. So we just need to be conscious of that. But really, I think to quote another Indigenous theologian, Richard Twiss, so really what we would hope for is that the church would see us as co-equal participants in the life, work and mission of the church, not the perpetual mission field of the church. And I often say here in Australia, Aboriginal people are the most over-evangelized group of people in the world, but yet 54% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia identify as Christian. The non-Indigenous population is 55%. But you don't see Aboriginal Christian leaders as leading missiology and mission in our theological colleges or in our churches, and that's what needs to change.
Thanks, Brooke. Lisa?
Yeah, I think some of the thoughts that I've had about what Indigenous diaspora majority world voices are teaching us about Christian mission are actually things like obviously listening, which we've really dug into a bit, suffering. I think as, especially as someone who has grown up in America and in the United States, we know very little about that. And we've got quite a bit to learn. The American dominant church in America, we've got a long way to go in terms of understanding what suffering and persecution are. you know, well, I won't be mean, but there are minuscule tasks that we make into mountains here in the States, that we call suffering, and the majority world has so much to teach us. I also think joy and persistence are lessons for Christian mission that we're learning from majority world voices. We've talked about the dualism. I think, you know, going forward, I said this in another forum recently, I think that the church beyond the moment is going to be a church that is both and. It's not, it's a more holistic, it's not just evangelism or justice, it is both. It's spirit, it's, you know, it's cruciform and, you know, resurrection. It has to encompass all of it. And I think that if we're isolated in our own little worlds and we're listening to people who say the exact same thing as we do in our own echo chambers, we miss the opportunity to prepare ourselves for mission and to be missioned, which we all need. We need to be missioned and remissioned and made more like Jesus.
And I think
Thanks.
part of the
Yeah.
Christian gospel, just to follow up, part of the Christian gospel, we forget that Jesus came for those who are suffering, who are marginalized, who were oppressed, because that's who he was with always, you know, the simple woman and etc. So I think when Lisa was talking about the suffering, I think, yes, I think the indigenous voices and the majority world voices, they are the ones that, or we are the ones that are suffering or oppressed by the Western Empire. So I think, you know, and I said earlier that God is always on the side of the oppressed. God is with the oppressed. God is suffering with the oppressed. So I think once we recognize the problems that we're creating, then we can go and look for some more liberative ways of in becoming a Christian and understanding how God is with us in this kind of journey towards liberation. You know, liberating us from oppression, from slavery, from racism and the sexism that occurs, you know, and has been part of our Christian history for the last 2,000 years. You know, slavery has been part of us for a long time. So I think when we hear the voices, we recognize the sin that Christianity has participated in.
Sarah, one of the things that really disturbs me is the way in which we in the West sort of turn the theology and practices of other contexts and cultures into something exotic or contextual or niche, you know, something that we might be able to learn something from if we dig deeply enough, you know, the kind of superior attitude that is often common in the West. You know, maybe there's something there if we dig deep enough that can inform our rich, deep, non-contextual Western theology. There seems to be this sort of
Yeah.
weird superior.
Well, you know, yeah, and Graham, when you say that, you know, when we teach in our seminaries, you know, every time we say theology, everybody knows it's just the white male Western European theology. And if you're going to teach Asian American, then nobody will accept that as theology. It's something kind of on the side if we have time. And you're going to always put the adjective there. So feminist theology, Asian American theology, indigenous theology, Hispanic theology. It's not the norm. So I think, you know, your book is trying to say we got to listen to these other voices. Let's break down what the norm is, okay? Because that voice has actually been very destructive. You know, the colonialism that has been happening, the destruction of the world, you know, the planet, because we think about empire and just, you know, going and conquering everything, conquering the land, conquering the people. So I think has been very destructive. So maybe that shouldn't be the norm,
Yeah, when I
but it
started
has been for the last 2,000 years.
research for these books, many of my theological colleagues said to me, well, this is genuinely what they said to me, some of them at least, that this is going to be a very slim volume, isn't it? Because the vast majority of the rich theological work that's been done has been done in the West. And they weren't
Wow.
when they said that as well. So Well, what I've discovered, of course, is that if you dig into the theological life and practices and faith communities beyond the West, you discover so much rich and diverse, profound um, practices and theological thought. Um, and it really disturbs me again that when we look at theological curriculums, when we look at reading lists in many of our seminaries in North America or in other Western contexts, the reading lists are very narrow, they're very Western. They treat theological perspectives and traditions outside the West like they are exotic, or they're African theology or Asian theology or Aboriginal theology, or and then once you've done that sort of exotic theological work, now we'll get back to doing real theology. And this kind of attitude, I think, is so
That
damaging.
happens all the time.
We're just not listening to the voices of God's people globally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think with colonialism too, we feel like if it's not written in English, then it's not real theology. You know, you can't write in Korean or Chinese or in any of the African languages or indigenous voices. It has to be in English because it's not scholarly enough. So, you know, when you share that, it's going to be a slim volume. That's so painful for me to hear because there are so many theological voices out there that's not in English, and they don't need to be in English. We have this kind of empire mind that everything needs to be in English. And if it's not credible.
Yeah, and what is theology? You know, theology happens everywhere, every day, as people live their lives together and work through their struggles and their joys and their challenges, don't they? So it raises that question. We've talked about in our discussion dualism, or rather holistic approaches to faith, listening, language, issues of language, suffering, joy, and perseverance. The next thing that I want to dig a little bit deeper into is again focusing on listening and perhaps practical responses to the question of how do we actually get better at listening to and being led by Indigenous, diaspora, and majority world voices. You know, we've talked about these great aspirations, and no doubt people would hear this and most people would say, yeah, we're on board, we agree with that. But what do we actually do to get there? So if you could jump in there, someone, maybe I'll nominate someone this time. I reckon, Brooke, you can go first this time. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Uh, there's so many things. I think just to follow on from that previous discussion, which leads into this one, is, you know, so much. I'm still fighting in these lands now called Australia for Christians to be able to be comfortable that I am Indigenous and Christian. That the two aren't compatible. And so it's only people don't realize that their white culture is a culture, and it's only Indigenous culture that's ever put under a Christian microscope and not white non-Indigenous culture. And so how do we get better at listening to and being led? One of the obstacles, and this is great where Graham's book comes in, because not only has he highlighted these theologians, but some of our work as well, and so people can reference that work. But it is a hard slog for our work to be recognised, and that's the power of the institutions, the ongoing impacts of colonisation. That means that we don't get the book deals. Some of us can write the papers, but we don't have access to the structures to be able to get it printed or accessible. There's a great book by an Indigenous theologian, Reverend Denise Champion, Yada Wandata, that I use in pretty much every theological paper I write to try and quote it. But there's no credit card facilities. You have to email a person. And so people have said to me, oh, Brooke, I can't read that book. It was too hard to get. And I'm like, no, that's the reality of how Indigenous Christians and our resources aren't available. Theological libraries who say they can't afford to put the one Indigenous book in their theological library. This is some of the things that we have to change. So yes, there's listening, and sometimes we're being invited. We're still not being invited enough. And instead of holding a book club, people can hold a book club on Graham's book. I'm very happy for that. But in our theological colleges, I saw recently They wanted to be a book club in unpacking whiteness of Australian theologians. And it was all white Australian theologians who wanted to be part of the book club. And I'm like, it's not the book club where you start. You have to start by inviting us into the theological colleges to teach. But then we face the opposition. Oh, no, Brooke, you can't come and teach because you don't have a PhD. There's only 5 Aboriginal Christians in the history of Australia that have ever had a PhD in theology. And through NAITS, we're starting to change that. But this is the obstacles that we're up against. So you continually, to listen to and be led, non-Indigenous peoples and particularly white people need to deconstruct the systems that continue to exclude us, because otherwise you're not going to be able to listen. And another key thing, so one of the things I wanted to say was stop reading and start doing. But then I'm like, no, I want people to read Graham's book and anything that Lisa and Grace have done and the other people in the books as well that are highlighted. But it's actually building relationship, which comes back to the community, realizing we're part of the community. The other thing I wanted to point out is that that particularly here in Australia, non-Indigenous, white and some other cultures are not the mission or cross-cultural experts. And so I'm still fighting to be seen as a cross-cultural expert because I don't hold a piece of paper. These are things that we need to change, and that a whole part of this, like I can talk about colonization as I have, but to not underestimate the spiritual realm of what is going on here. I've written about reconciliation without repentance and recognition without dignity, and how they've been used to lead to the postponement of justice for Indigenous peoples in Australia. And that there is a spiritual element, and this is where Christians have to become involved. We should know Jesus as the great transformer, the great healer, the great comforter. But sadly, we've got a long way to go in even sometimes perhaps reclaiming Jesus. And just one final point, following on from some of the other discussions, I've recently had to point out to people, I've had kind of a light bulb moment myself, that what's been happening is that for mainly white male pastors, teachers, theologians in Australia, they have the privilege to separate justice and ministry. In an Aboriginal community, our Aboriginal Christian leaders, you are there with community, you are ministering. The churches aren't supporting our work, but we're doing it because the call of Jesus on our lives is so strong. But you don't separate justice and ministry. They are one and the same. And so if anyone's ever thought about separating the two, or saying justice, we're only doing ministry, which is, connected to the dualism discussion we were having, that is an element of privilege for you to be able to separate those.
Thanks, Brooke.
Yeah,
Lisa or Grace, yeah.
So when Brooke was talking about the books, I think we need to read the books, but be very intentional of who we're going to read. Some of the seminaries here in the US were trying to push, less white curriculum. So less white history, like authors. So we want to read more Indigenous authors, Black authors, Hispanic, Latina authors, Asian Americans. So we want to incorporate the voices that haven't been heard. So these are kind of intentional ways I think people need to do it. Not all seminaries are on board. My seminary is, but I think things have to be intentional when it comes to listening. When I think about just everyday things, we have a president who just yaks away. Like right now, he is having a Twitter storm. So, that's an example of not listening. He's not intentional. He is overpowering. He never listens to nobody. But I think when it comes to real listening to people, you gotta be interested. You gotta show that there's something to learn, that you don't know everything. Even my own specialty of Asian American voices, it's so limiting, right? There's so much I learned from Black theology here in the US. I think the Black theologians, because of their history of slavery, have taught me so much. There's nuances, there's languages, there's words that I can't capture with my own Asian theology. And when I listen to the Indigenous and Native American voices, particularly here because I'm in the US. There's, I learned so much from the Native American scholars that teach theology here, and the Latinx scholars. If we're not going to be intentional saying, I don't know everything, Augustine, who said, very important quote, when you say you know God, that is not God. I think we have to humble ourselves. Whatever language that we have, whatever experience that we have, it's only going to get to this small little aspect of this infinite God that we worship, that we want to come to learn. So the more voices that we have, the more languages that we have, the more intentional that we're going to be saying, oh, you know what? Brooke can teach me something. And Lisa can teach me something, and Sarah can teach me something. All these different voices can teach me something. The intentionality has to be there. We have to sit there and say, there's so much that I can learn from listening to them, from reading their papers, maybe reading their emails, their articles or books. There is so much to learn. And if they write in a different language, somehow we have to have people who can translate into different languages so that we can have access. These really need to be intentional. When Graham has his website up, he had you have Spanish, Graham, and then he did Korean, which was like, wow, nobody thinks of translating something into Korean, but Graham did that. So it has to be intentional that, you can have these Korean voices, and Graham's going to lift them up. Like, I don't know of many people who will do that. So, when I think about Graham and he does these things intentionally, I think that's very important. There's so much to learn, so much to share. Even just this Zoom book launch, hearing the different voices, I've learned so much already in the last 40 minutes. So I think this is great, and we need to do more of these. So thanks, Graham, for the platform, but then also always lifting up the voices that have been marginalized, that have been kind of pushed aside as unimportant.
I want to say a warm welcome to Ruth, who's joined us. Hi, Ruth. How's it going?
Hello, I'm so sorry. Just internet trouble, and try as I might, I was unable to join until now. So I'm very sorry, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to see these beautiful faces of sisters and you, Graham. So my apologies, and I'm grateful to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. And, Ruth needs very little introduction, being a theologian, missiologist, writer, educator, storyteller who's contributed so much to our lives, our faith, and our sense of what God is doing in the world. So wonderful to have you here with us, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a joy to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening.
Sarah, one of the things that when it comes to sort of how we can get better at listening and learning from diverse voices, one thing that strikes me as a middle-aged or aging white man is how often in our institutions we start at the wrong place. So we do things like, we say to ourselves, how do we get better at listening to voices of diaspora or immigrant peoples? So a bunch of us, maybe 5 or 6 white men sit in a room. We come up with a strategic plan for how we're going to get better at listening to diaspora voices. Once we've established our institution and our curriculum, then we invite those voices to speak into them. It's just really, it's completely the wrong way up. For me, it's all about just stop. Okay, we've stopped. Thank you. Now let's just stop and invite peoples and voices that have not been heard to come and to show us what does it mean to be God's people. And retire into the background, take a posture of humility and openness, become a learner, and allow others to shape our life and our way of seeing God and and see yourself as a curator, as a facilitator, as someone who wants to elevate and amplify and honor the voices of others, rather than somebody who's taking the lead and then inviting others in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ruth, what we're talking about is, well, you've picked it up from what Graham's saying, no doubt, ways that we can actually get better at listening to and being led by Indigenous, diaspora and majority world voices. And something that's been touched on, Grace was talking about the complexity of what's out there in terms of majority world voices and how it takes time to stop and listen. And, you know, Grace, while you were talking, I was thinking, well, even just when you say Asia, you know, and we say Asian theologies, what are we saying there? The complexity is mind-blowing, really. And the challenging thing is that relationships just take so much time, don't they? You can't hurry that sort of learning process.
Yeah, we become lazy. And, you know, Asia is huge, very diverse, you know, so many languages, people, so many religion. And, you know, with Christianity, there's just different forms of Christianity just in Asia itself. So I think it's important, you know, so much, you know, theology written in Korean language that's not being translated. And there are theologians in China, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and in Japan and in India. Some of them are in English and majority of the stuff aren't. So we got to be very intentional. And sorry to take up so much time, but I also teach at a Quaker school, and Quakers are great at listening. You know, their form of silent worship where they are listening with the Spirit of God, you know, I think that teaches us a lot. And I think Indigenous spirituality and African spirituality kind of teaches us those things, to kind of sit there in the presence of God, sit in the presence of our friends and other scholars and pastors, those in ministry, and be intentionally listening.
Great, thanks, Grace. The next question, and Ruth, we might come to you, and you can have a chance to respond first, and then we'll go to Lisa. But at the end of the book, Graham talks about being conformed to Christ. What does that mean to you? And Ruth, if you want to jump back and respond to the last question, feel free to do that too.
Conformed to Christ. This God who chooses to empty himself, as Philippians says, right? To empty himself, to divest from power in order to become one of us. What does that say to us about how we relate to people that are other, that are different, that are not us? We have so much presumption about what we know, what we have, who we are, and there's all this paraphernalia that builds up our identity, right? And it takes an emptying to be willing to listen, to be willing to acknowledge the fact that, oh, maybe I have something to learn. Maybe I'm lacking many things. Maybe the fact that I am wealthy, the fact that I am white, the fact that I am from a powerful nation, so many things that we assume give us a certain status. Maybe, just maybe, those are not really what they're billed to be. Maybe, just maybe, we need to shed, we need to divest, we need to get rid of, we need to empty ourselves in order to recognize our need to learn, to receive, to walk alongside, to think that our formulas and our modes of operation and our prescriptions and our theological articulations are not, as somebody from New Zealand told me, they are not the mother of Tarzan. They are not everything. They are not, you know. So I think there's that challenge of the emptying of ourselves, which is so preeminent in God's choice to become human. There's a huge key for us there to challenge us into what our attitude should be. Your attitude be as that of Jesus Christ.
Thanks, Ruth. How about you, Lisa? Would you like to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think Graham does such a great job in that final chapter of breaking down, you know, multiple ways we can be conformed to Christ. And I think it's a perfect way to wrap up all of the content of the book. And I think I'll just maybe try and answer the last question alongside of this one, because I think being conformed to Christ is what we've talked about is you know, the humility, the divesting, the taking time to listen. You can't listen well if you already have an idea in your head of what you're going to say next. And oftentimes we come to learning with what we already know, and we come to listening with what we want to say. And as real learners, what we have to do is begin with suspending judgment. So if I'm going to listen well and I'm going to learn, I have to force myself to suspend judgment to receive what I'm about to receive. That is the first posture. It's a beginning place. I think we've also mentioned the importance of relationship and what submission would look like, mutual submission, so that it's not just about information. In an information age with the internet full of all kinds of things we can consume, what we should not consume is relationship. And we have to become, set ourselves under one another's leadership so that we can learn and be in relationship. And then the last thing that I was going to say is some of the best scholarship comes from the abuelitas who've never studied a single thing in seminary. I tell you, my abuela has taught me more about following Jesus than 3 years in seminary and 10 years in ministry. So we need to take on the abuelitas, the listening to the abuelitas, because even if they're never published, they've got so much to teach us and help us understand what it means to be conformed to Christ.
Thanks, Lisa. Brooke, what does being conformed to Christ mean for you?
This has been such a wonderful discussion, and I love everything that everyone said. For me, what it actually looks like is that foundations become shaky, foundations as we know them. And so I talk about personally, but it will go through every aspect of society, including the church, if we are truly conformed to Christ. It's an unsettledness. And I say Jesus is the great unsettler. And yes, that's a play on the word settler, because Jesus unsettles me in heart, mind, and spirit each and every day. That's not because I'm Indigenous, that's because I'm Christian. Being Indigenous just adds a whole nother level and meaning to what it means to be unsettled. And so if we are truly conformed to Christ, which I think we can be, and that's where the future of the church sits, in this need for what Graham has articulated so well. But it means the foundations of society in places like Australia and the United States of America start to crumble, and we rebuild a community, Christ-centered community, where the world looks more like most of this panel and leaders and teachers. Just as I've mentioned a lot through this panel, other Indigenous voices, but what majority world voices, and it's a bit weird where I sit in that context, have taught me, but through communities like Infinite. You know, when I first heard Ruth do a presentation, it was Surrender Conference brought her to these lands now called Australia. I had never heard a theologian speak the way that she did, which was so poetically, so beautifully, but also that was so academic as well. It was a very different style. And by being able to hear Ruth, it gave me permission to do what I do. And we have to realize that Indigenous and majority world or other voices that aren't white, we've been separated from one another, and that's part of the global colonial project as well. And so this is where I'm so grateful for Graham in bringing all of us into conversation together today, but through this book as well, and that we need to continue to come together. But God will continue to bring us together. He's bringing Indigenous peoples in these lands now called Australia together, with world Indigenous voices together through NATES, with then majority world voices through Infinite, and that will keep growing. And so, yeah, that unsettledness is already happening, and let's tune into it and continue to be unsettled each and every day.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Brooke. How about you, Grace?
I was going to say, yep. So Graham, ends the book with the conformity, conforming to Christ. So my question would be, because here in the U.S. today, people are saying, who is Christ? Because in the sense that they keep emphasizing this white Christ. Okay, so a bunch of white Christians are saying Jesus is white, and it's been a big deal over the summer because of the racial tensions that's happening here in the US. So they keep emphasizing Jesus is white. So the rest of us, who are the people of color, say Jesus was never white. So, I think throughout Christianity, people have been trying to conform to Christ, but the Christ that they were conforming to was this white Jesus, which then translates into this white supremacy that exists and is played out in America today and around the world. So we got this white supremacy. So why are we keep saying this white Jesus? So I grew up with a white Jesus. I had that picture of white Jesus in my living room. My mother loved that picture. She carried it around every time we moved. When I was in seminary in the 90s, I went to India for the summer through the Presbyterian Church, and everywhere I was in India was that same white Jesus. So the missionaries have gone around the world and shared this white Jesus. But Jesus, born a Palestinian Jew, was never white, but we keep making him white. It's the white male European theologian. So this whole 2,000 years of history. And so, throughout the 2,000 years, conforming to Christ, but they kept conforming to this white Christ. You see this white image everywhere. You go to Sistine Chapel, God is white. You go, majority of the art until recently, when indigenous artists and artists around the world are portraying a different Jesus. So I think the first question is, which Jesus are you conforming to? It can't be this white supremacist Jesus that goes and colonizes and dominates and rips up the earth. We don't want that kind of Jesus. We want to conform to this Jesus that's liberating, that is on the side of the oppressed, that liberates women, that embraces the sinful woman. That's the Jesus that we want to conform to.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this. It drips with irony in a way, doesn't it? That those who think they're bringing this white supremacist Jesus don't realize that where they're going, what the people are doing, is where they're actually going to meet Jesus. Graham, we're going to come to you now to just close off today's book launch. And there are 3 questions that I'm going to ask you. The first one is that if people are interested in buying the book, and I hope they are after hearing this discussion today, where and how can they purchase it?
Thanks so much, Sarah. And the words that have been spoken are so profound. For me, as all that I am, I have to remind myself daily that I need to repent of my deformed, misshapen vision and image of Christ, the one that I have inherited, which so often is colonizing and oppressive and shaped in my image or shaped in the image of my culture. And I need to, being conformed to Christ is partly, it's a process of constant conversion. So repentance from myself, repentance from the image or the vision of Christ that I've inherited, and conversion to Christ as Christ presents Christ to the world, often through voices and cultures and perspectives that are entirely different than those that I've inherited, or that are entirely different from me. So conformity to Christ is this constant conversion to Christ and to Christ in the other, or Christ speaking to me through others. That's a daily process. And also I remember, it was in well, I don't remember, I'm not quite this old, but in 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. preached about being transformed non-conformists. So from Romans 12, chapter 2, he challenged society, church and society, to be transformed non-conformists. So conformity is this sort of strange mix of being shapen in the image of God, while not while at the same time being a transformed non-conformist that divests oneself of the misshapen, dysfunctional, oppressive, colonizing Christ that I've inherited, and being conformed to the Christ who presents Christ to the world in our Lord Jesus Christ. And for me, that's about discovering afresh, what does shalom, justice, peace, love look like? And how does Jesus present himself to me in those ways, in ways that surprise me, startle me, unsettle me, move me, confront me in ways that I didn't anticipate, I didn't ask for, but I desperately need. So thank you for those questions and for the responses. So, yeah, well.
And also, Graham, I must say that you're not the only one that inherited it. I think we all inherited it. So it's this deconstructing of the white Jesus that we inherited. So I think you're not there by yourself. I think we are it's just been the dominant Christianity. And so I think what your book is trying to say and point to is that we have to listen to these other voices to help us deconstruct this white Jesus that Christianity has been preaching about for the last 2,000 years, because that white Jesus can be a little dangerous, with the white supremacy that is attached to it and the colonialism, the empire building. So I think what your book is trying to say is you got to listen to these other voices so we can deconstruct the Jesus that has been preached to us for the last 2,000 years and embrace a liberative Jesus, more of a spirit Jesus that is not bound by this whiteness, but beyond the whiteness, and goes to the other voices, indigenous, the Asian voices, the Hispanic Latinx voices, the Black voices. And I think that's what your book is trying to point to. So I'm just grateful for that and everything. So thank you, Graham.
So Graham, the all-important question, how do we get our hands on this book?
So the book is available on Amazon Book Depository and Barnes and Noble and the usual places where you buy books. You can also buy it from the Cascade website. My website, grahamjosephhill.com, profiles the books and provides the links for where you can buy the book, and you can contact me through that website and also join the launch team for the book if you'd like to. And I'm so thankful and grateful to all those who've been involved in the launch today and for your generosity, insights and grace.
Excellent.
And I must say, if you're going to get this one, might as well get all of his other books too, that are all up on the website.
At least volume 1.
Read them all. Yeah, read them all.
Now, before we close off, is there any final or closing comments that anyone would like to make? Just to put you on the spot. I've got to get my little gavel out.
But I'll just say one thing. I'm just always grateful for Graham's leadership, his intentional listening, and his always elevating voices. And I think today, just getting the diverse women's voices, that's almost unheard of. But he continues to do this, and I'm always grateful for that. So thank you, Graham, for that and for your scholarship, your ministry, and your leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace.
We need more Grahams. Yeah. Or more Grahams.
Yeah,
That's
I think the issue is so often as women and as minority women, we are fully aware that we're often brought in as tokens to fill, the check box. Oh, we need a woman. Tick. We need a non-dominant culture woman. Tick. Right? And so, I mean, I think it's a learning process we are going through as a global community, and that's part of the learnings we've experienced through Infamit. And then, Graham, your efforts to not just tick boxes, but to legitimately, wholeheartedly, humbly open up space to make these voices heard and to affirm, because often colonialism is not just out there, it's in here, right? We're told, we're prescribed these matrices in which certain things have to fit in a certain way. And so the opportunity to really just say, oh, actually, maybe, yes, maybe there is something to contribute from the South Pacific, from Latinos in North America, from Korea, you know, from these diverse places, legitimately, not just as tokens. And I think that's a learning we need to continue working towards as a global community of followers of Jesus Christ.
Lisa, did you have something to add?
Just a huge kudos to Graham. Do you know how many panels I have sat on where I'm the only woman for the reasons Ruth just exactly described? And I just would say, thank you for being the only man tonight. I don't know if it was a resistance to like, well, should I invite one guy? No, I am so great that this is, you know, you've highlighted women's voices and have had a woman moderate and have given us the platform this evening to talk about your work. And so I would say just thank you, and thank you for the work that you put into this book. It's remarkable. I mean, I will keep it as a resource over and over and over again. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Brooke, you're welcome to weigh in if you'd like to say anything to finish.
I think just there's one thing at the front of my mind, and it's specifically for those here in these lands now called Australia, but to understand the ramifications around the world. And I talked about those shaky foundations, how the foundations will become shaky, and we've talked about mission and all of these. And even as Graham talked about, you know, the Christ that he's inherited, and we've had a discussion about that these lands now called Australia still have to wrestle with the fact that Jesus did not come on the boats with the first fleet with the English in 1788. And that undoes everything. And so I think that leads into just thanking Graham for this book, thanking all the panelists, all of your incredible work as well. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting. And let's see more panels like this one into the future, and to keep continuing to raise each other up. Graham has done a great job through this book, but to never underestimate that we do need to talk about each other's work and continue to cheer each other on.
Beautiful, thank you. All right, well, this is me about to wrap up. Graham, this is your last chance to add something if you'd like to.
No, just a huge thank you to everybody.
Great. Thanks, Graham. So thanks to everyone who's joined today, whether you're on Zoom or whether you're watching through Facebook Live or on YouTube afterwards even. Thank you, of course, to Graham and to our wonderful panelists, Ruth, Grace, Lisa and Brooke. Also, thanks to Meg Nelson from the University of Divinity, because she is our tech and professional guru. And I also would like to thank those partnering with the launch, and that includes Stirling Theological College, the University of Divinity, Common Grace, Missio Alliance, International Fellowship for Missioners Transformation, Infamit, and Micah Global. By way of a closing blessing today, I would like to read a poem to you all. This poem is by Jeff Page, and it recently won the Australian Catholic University 2020 Prize for Poetry. So as we listen and go out, may we each be moved beyond our assumed boundary lines. The poem is called Jericho. I didn't mean to stop, believe me. Mostly I'd have kept right on. The stony road to Jericho is hazardous at any time. A guy with saddlebags and samples is asking for it, really. and of course, a man well bruised has always been the bandit's ruse. I had my wife's good admonitions singing in my ears. Keep on riding, stop for no one. But what I saw that day was different, and had me reining in my horse, who likewise was a little spooked, the cries inchoate at the start, before resolving into Hebrew. I knew right then it would be hard, and complicated too, those Jews with all their wayward views upon the God we share. There's been some history between us, but as for now, the man was naked, his robe and all possessions gone. They'd left some welts across his shoulders. An ankle too was almost broken. He gasped a story through his thanks. 3 robbers, young, with heavy clubs and heavier demands, a language that he didn't know, but understood the drift of. He told it through his thickened vowels, a sudden bout of violence, then the silence of the road. I patched him up with oil and wine, some bandages I had by chance, continuing without complaint. He told me there'd been 2 before me, who'd managed not to notice. In a hurry to the temple, he winced and added dryly. Of course, he caught my accent too, and maybe thought at first I'd stopped to give a coup de grace or steal his less than nothing. But no, for reasons that I then and still don't understand, I hoisted him up on my horse and led it slowly to an inn. We turned up just on dusk. He groaned a little with the jolts, but wearing now the robe I'd offered, his dignity returned, almost. At the inn I hired 2 rooms and waved aside his promises. Gratitude's a hard emotion. Not wanting more of it, next morning I had a tray sent to his room. Gave the keeper 2 denarii and guaranteed the rest. There's still some days to go, I said, before he's fit to travel. I swung into the saddle, with my wife's words still with me still, closer in but softer now. I didn't leave him an address. There's no point in prolonging things. Our differences are deeper than decencies and misadventure. He'd be okay from there, I figured. At best, among our own, the 2 of us will find ourselves a bit less simple in our givens. And so, I ride to Jericho, working on a form of words my wife will understand. Amen. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for everyone for joining us.
Amen.
All right. See you all next time.